At the annual Hayes Industries Gala, the ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes. The city's elite had gathered to celebrate another year of record profits, and the atmosphere buzzed with self-congratulatory cheer. Waiters in crisp white jackets wove through the crowd, carrying silver trays laden with caviar-topped blinis and flutes of Dom Perignon. The string quartet in the corner played something classical and expensive, the kind of music that cost more per hour than most people made in a month. Diamonds sparkled on wrists and throats. Designer gowns and bespoke suits swished across marble floors, and the air was thick with expensive colognes and carefully curated pheromone perfumes designed to mask natural scents for social occasions. On the central dance floor, a couple was locked in an intimate embrace. The alpha male, tall, broad-shouldered, devastatingly handsome in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, held his partner close, their lips meeting in a kiss that was far too passionate for a business function. His hands roamed possessively over the other man's back, fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his companion's suit, and the kiss deepened, tongues tangling in a display of ownership that made several older executives shift uncomfortably in their seats. The alpha's scent, something dark and smoky, like aged whiskey and expensive leather, filled the space around them, marking his territory for all to see. "Is that CEO Hayes?" A woman in a floor-length Vera Wang whispered to her companion, her eyes wide with barely concealed scandal. "The same. And that's his executive secretary, Liam Chun." Her companion's eyes widened. "I thought he was married. I heard he had an Omega husband somewhere. Someone said he was from a publishing family." "He is. No one's ever seen his husband, though. Some say he's a recluse who never leaves the penthouse. Others say." She trailed off meaningfully, her pheromones spiking with intrigue. "They look incredible together. Two alphas. So modern. So bold. His devotion is really something to admire. That's true love right there. You can see it in the way he touches him." Meanwhile, Ethan Hayes stood frozen at the edge of the ballroom, a cold chill racing down his spine as if he'd been plunged into an ice bath. His scent, usually warm sandalwood with hints of cedar and something subtly sweet, the hallmark of a well-bred Omega, soured with distress, though no one noticed. No one ever noticed him. The champagne flute in his hand trembled, and he set it down carefully on a passing tray before his grip could shatter the crystal. His hands were shaking. His entire body was shaking. He felt like he was watching his life collapse in slow motion, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. That man on the dance floor was Julian Hayes, his husband of 2 years. The secret husband. The Omega husband who existed in the shadows while Julian paraded his alpha virility for the entire world. The husband who had been told repeatedly that their marriage needed to remain hidden so no one could accuse Julian of building his empire on his Omega's wealthy family connections. The husband who had believed every word, who had sacrificed his pride and his identity and his very existence for the man he loved. And that wasn't just any secretary in Julian's arms. That was Liam Chun, Julian's executive assistant, a sharp-featured alpha with expensive taste and ruthless ambition. Liam's scent, something sharp and spicy, like cinnamon and smoke and the lingering residue of ambition, was all over Julian's suit, all over his skin, evidence of a physical intimacy that had been going on for over a year. The way Julian held him, the way he kissed him, the way he looked at him as if he were the center of the universe. Ethan had never been looked at that way. Not once in 2 years of marriage. Ethan's inner Omega keened with pain, a sound only he could hear. He wanted to scream, to cry, to throw himself between them and demand to know why. Why wasn't he good enough? Why wasn't he worthy of being seen? He'd given Julian everything. His love, his loyalty, his inheritance, his father's literary legacy, his reputation, his very soul. And this was how he was repaid. He'd been a fool. A complete and utter fool. He'd given up his career, his social life, his identity, all for a man who couldn't even be bothered to remember their anniversary. But he didn't scream. He didn't cry. His father had raised him to have dignity, even when the world was falling apart. Richard Hayes had been a man of principle, a man who believed in honesty and integrity above all else. He'd taught Ethan that the measure of a man wasn't in his wealth or his status, but in his character, in the way he treated others, in the choices he made when no one was watching. And Ethan had made a choice tonight. He'd chosen to leave. So he straightened his spine, smoothed down the front of his bespoke Dolce & Gabbana jacket, and walked out of the ballroom without a backward glance. No one saw him leave. No one ever did. The limousine ride back to the penthouse was a blur. Ethan stared out the window, watching Manhattan's glittering skyline pass by in a smear of lights and shadows, and tried to remember when everything had gone so terribly wrong. He was 27 years old, an Omega from one of the oldest publishing families in the country, and he'd somehow managed to make himself completely invisible in his own marriage. How had he gotten here? How had he let himself become so small, so silent, so utterly forgotten? 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had discovered the truth. He'd stopped by Julian's office with lunch, a rare treat, since Julian usually insisted Ethan stay home and out of sight. The man was always full of excuses. The board will think I'm weak if they know I have a husband who runs the household, or the investors might not understand a married CEO as young as me. Or, Ethan, baby, you know I'm proud of you, but we need to be careful. Just a little longer, okay? And Ethan had believed him. He'd believed every word because he'd wanted to believe. He'd wanted Julian to be the man he'd pretended to be during their courtship. Through the glass walls of the executive suite, Ethan had watched Julian bend Liam over the desk, the two alphas locked in a rough, possessive embrace that had left no room for interpretation. Julian's hands had been in Liam's hair, his mouth on Liam's neck, marking him like an Omega in an ancient claiming ritual. They had been rutting like animals, their alpha pheromones clashing and mingling in a display of dominance that had made Ethan's stomach turn. He'd stood there for what felt like hours, frozen, unable to look away, unable to move. The image had burned itself into his memory, a scar that would never fully heal. He hadn't made a scene. He'd walked back home, sat down at his father's antique oak desk, and drafted divorce papers. Yet he couldn't bring himself to file them. He kept giving Julian chances. Just one more. Just one more. He'll come back to me, he'd told himself. He loves me. I know he does. This is just a phase. He just needs to get it out of his system. All alphas go through this. It doesn't mean anything. It's just biology, just instinct. He'll come home to me. He always does. But the chances had become a habit, and the habit had become a lie. Every time he forgave Julian, he lost a little more of himself. Every time he looked the other way, he gave Julian permission to hurt him again. And now he was standing in the middle of a gala, watching the man he'd married kiss someone else in front of the entire world, and he realized he had nothing left to give. He was empty, hollow, a shell of the person he'd once been. Ethan Hayes was the son of a publishing dynasty, a man who had been raised to value loyalty above all else. His father, Richard Hayes, had been a legendary author and publisher, a man who'd built his empire on the principles of honesty and integrity. He'd raised Ethan alone after his wife died from complications during a difficult pregnancy, pouring all his love and attention into his only son. At 25, Ethan had met Julian at a charity event and fallen desperately in love. Julian was 33 then, a self-made alpha whose tech startup was just beginning to gain traction. He'd courted Ethan with flowers and poetry, with promises of building a life together. He'd swept Ethan off his feet with his ambition and his passion, his intensity and his charm. Ethan, a sheltered Omega who'd been protected by his father and then left alone after his father's sudden death, had believed every word. He'd been so young, so naive, so desperate to be loved. His father had been gone for less than a year when Julian appeared, and Ethan had latched onto him like a drowning man grasping at driftwood. He'd given Julian everything, his money, his connections, his name, his heart. And Julian had taken it all, and given nothing back. Not love, not loyalty, not even basic respect. They'd married in secret at a small courthouse in Connecticut. No press, no family, no fanfare. Julian said he wanted to protect Ethan's privacy, to ensure no one thought his success was built on his Omega's family connections. People will say I married you for your money, not for you, Julian had said, his hands cupping Ethan's face, his eyes full of false sincerity. I don't want anyone to think that. I want them to know I earned everything myself. Can you give me that, Ethan? Can you keep this a secret for us? I need you to trust me. Ethan had understood. He'd agreed. He'd played the perfect hidden spouse, managing the household, hosting dinners for Julian's parents, keeping their home a sanctuary where Julian could escape from the pressures of business. He'd cooked elaborate meals, planned social engagements, and provided the emotional support that Julian claimed to need. He'd been the ideal Omega husband, the kind that old-fashioned alphas bragged about to their friends. He'd been so good at being invisible that he'd become invisible to himself. But last year, Liam started at the company, and everything changed. At first, Ethan hadn't suspected anything. He'd assumed Julian was exhausted from work, stressed by the pressures of running a growing corporation. When Julian started staying out late, Ethan brought him coffee in the mornings and offered foot rubs at night. When Julian started coming home smelling of other people's pheromones, Ethan convinced himself it was just the stress of meetings, the close quarters of the office. When Julian stopped touching him entirely, Ethan told himself it was just a phase, just the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. He'd been so desperate to believe in the marriage that he'd willfully ignored every warning sign. It wasn't a phase. It was complete emotional abandonment. Julian had stopped loving him, if he'd ever loved him at all. He'd stopped seeing him, stopped caring about his needs, stopped treating him like a partner, and started treating him like a piece of furniture. And Ethan had let him. He'd let him because he'd been too afraid to be alone. He'd let him because he'd convinced himself that any love was better than no love at all. Ethan sat on the leather sofa in their penthouse apartment, staring at the divorce papers he'd drafted weeks ago. The Manhattan skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, mocking him with its cold brilliance. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and he glanced at the screen. It was a text from his childhood friend, Connor Vance. Connor, I heard what happened at the gala. Everyone's talking. How long are you going to let him treat you like this? How am I worse than him? Ethan looked at the message and suddenly felt how foolish he'd been. Connor Vance, an alpha from a family as prominent as Ethan's own, had loved him quietly for years. They'd grown up together, their families connected by business and mutual respect. Connor was everything Julian wasn't: steady, reliable, patient, kind. He'd never pushed Ethan, never demanded anything. He'd just been there, a constant presence in the background, waiting for Ethan to notice him. He'd been the safe harbor Ethan had ignored in favor of stormy seas. Ethan had always dismissed Connor's feelings, telling himself they were just friends, that Connor was too mild, too soft. He'd chosen Julian's fire and passion instead. He'd chosen the excitement of being pursued, the thrill of a secret romance, the illusion of being the only one who could tame Julian Hayes. He'd chosen the sparkle and the shine, never realizing that what glittered was fool's gold. He'd chosen a man who didn't deserve him over a man who would have worshipped him. But Julian's fire had burned him alive, and Julian's passion had been directed elsewhere for over a year. And Connor had never stopped waiting. He'd never stopped hoping. He'd been there all along, patient and constant, waiting for Ethan to wake up. Ethan picked up the pen, his father's fountain pen, the one he'd written his manuscripts with, the one that had been passed down through 3 generations of the Hayes family, and signed the divorce papers with a steady hand. His signature was clean and decisive, exactly the way his father had taught him. The door opened. Julian walked in, a lazy smile on his handsome face. He was on the phone, his deep alpha voice warm and indulgent. "Baby, wasn't keeping you company all night enough? I told you, it was just business. I'm home now, aren't I?" He laughed, a low, possessive sound that used to make Ethan's heart flutter. Yeah, tomorrow. I promise. I'll take you anywhere you want. No, baby, I love you too. Go to sleep. He hung up and finally noticed Ethan on the sofa. What are you doing sitting in the dark? You should be in bed. It's late. Ethan slid the papers across the coffee table. Sign these. Julian's phone buzzed with another text. He didn't even glance at the papers. He'd always been confident in Ethan's devotion, viewing him as an obedient, compliant Omega. The perfect spouse, the ideal partner, the one who would never cause him any trouble. He took the pen and signed without looking, his signature looping carelessly across the bottom of the document. There, he said carelessly. Happy now? We settled whatever it is you were upset about. Ethan let out a long, shaky breath. Finally, 30 days until the divorce was finalized, and he'd be free. His inner Omega purred with something close to relief, even as his heart broke into 1,000 pieces. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Julian emerged from the bedroom in fresh clothes, heading for the door again. I've got a business thing. Don't wait up. Another business thing? Ethan asked quietly. His voice was steady, calm. He didn't sound like a man whose marriage was ending. He didn't sound like a man whose heart was breaking. He sounded like a man who was already gone. He sounded like a man who had finally found his peace. Julian shrugged. You know how it is. The company never sleeps. He walked out without looking back, without a kiss, without even a word of goodbye. Ethan gripped his phone and sent a reply to Connor's message. Ethan, if I choose you this time, will you still have me? His heart hammered in his chest. There was no immediate response. Julian was already gone, off to whatever Liam had texted him about. Ethan didn't care anymore. He was done. He was so done. His phone rang. Connor's name appeared on the screen, and Ethan answered with trembling fingers. Look out your window. Ethan rushed to the window and saw Connor standing in the courtyard below, his alpha frame silhouetted against the city lights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet strength that Ethan had always taken for granted. His dark hair was windswept, and even from this distance, Ethan could see the intensity in his brown eyes. Connor was dressed simply. Jeans and a leather jacket, completely inappropriate for the cold night, but he looked like he belonged there, like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. His scent drifted up even from this distance, clean pine and cedar, warm and steady and reassuring. Then his gentle voice echoed through the phone. Congratulations on your new beginning. The sky exploded with fireworks. Reds and golds and blues painted the darkness, illuminating Connor's face as he looked up at the window. The fireworks burst and sparkled, reflecting off the glass of the surrounding skyscrapers, and Ethan's heart, which had been frozen for so long it didn't even remember how to beat, began to thaw. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be surprised, to be delighted, to be seen. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be valued. He ran out of the apartment, down the elevator, and across the courtyard. His dress shoes slipped on the pavement, but he didn't care. He ran toward Connor like a man running toward salvation, and when he reached him, Connor caught him in his arms, burying his face in Ethan's neck, breathing in his sandalwood and cedar scent. His own scent, clean pine and something warmer, something like home, wrapped around Ethan like a blanket, comforting his Omega instincts in a way that Julian's scent had never done. I missed you back then because I was weak, Connor whispered. His voice was rough, raw with emotion. I thought if I just waited, you'd see me. But you didn't. So I left. I went to London. I buried myself in work. I told myself I was over you. His voice cracked. But I never was. I never will be. I'm not going to let go this time. I'll hold on forever, no matter what it takes. I'll fight for you for the rest of my life. Connor. Ethan couldn't find the words. His throat was tight, his eyes blurry with tears. You asked if I'd still have you? It's not like that. It's never been like that. He pulled back, cupping Ethan's face in his hands, his eyes wet with unshed tears. You chose me. That's all I've ever wanted. It's everything I ever dreamed of. It's all I ever prayed for, all I ever hoped for, all I ever needed. I don't want you to come to me because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to come to me because you want me. And you did. Tears streamed down Ethan's face. For the first time in years, he wasn't struggling alone. For the first time in years, someone saw him. Someone wanted him. Someone loved him. He'd spent so long convincing himself that Julian's love was enough, that Julian's attention was all he needed, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly cherished. He kissed Connor, and it was like coming home. The next 30 days were a countdown. Ethan marked each passing day on his calendar, waiting for the moment he'd be free of Julian completely. He'd already spoken to his lawyers, arranged for the division of assets, and ensured that his father's inheritance was protected from Julian's grasping hands. The divorce was going to be swift and clean. Ethan had offered Julian nothing, and Julian, in his arrogance, hadn't asked for anything. He'd been so sure of Ethan's devotion that he hadn't even read the papers he'd signed. His friends kept him updated on Julian's activities. Not that he asked, but the gossip circuit was relentless. The Manhattan elite loved nothing more than a good scandal, and Julian Hayes's very public affair with his executive secretary was the juiciest story in years. It was the kind of story that kept people talking at cocktail parties, the kind of scandal that got whispered about in exclusive clubs and discussed in hushed tones at charity galas. "Did you hear?" his friend Marcus called, his voice breathless with excitement. Julian took Liam to Miami for a business conference. They're staying at the Ritz, and someone saw them at the spa together. Together, Ethan, in the couple's suite. They were getting massages side by side, and then they went for a private dinner on the beach. It was so romantic that even the staff were swooning. Someone said Julian rented out the whole restaurant. Ethan smiled grimly. "I'm sure they're having a wonderful time. Are you okay? I can come over. We can drink wine and watch bad movies and pretend the world isn't ending." "I'm fine, Marcus. Really, I've never been better." And it was true. Every day that passed made Ethan feel lighter, freer, more like himself. He'd been so trapped in his marriage, so consumed by the need to make things work with Julian, that he'd forgotten who he was. Now, slowly, he was remembering. He was remembering the person he'd been before Julian, the one who'd loved to read, who'd loved to write, who'd loved to walk in the park and watch the seasons change. He was remembering the person his father had raised him to be. He was starting to like that person again. Photos of Julian and Liam surfaced on social media. A dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant. A private cruise around the bay. A romantic walk along the beach at sunset. Liam leaning into Julian's side, his eyes closed, his alpha scent carefully curated for the camera. The photos were everywhere, and Liam, who knew about Ethan and Julian's marriage, who had been gloating about it for months, posted them with gleeful abandon. His pinned post was a photo of their intertwined hands with the caption, "Holding hands with the one for a lifetime." His feed was filled with images of their life together, carefully staged to look like a fairy tale. Liam thought this would hurt Ethan. Instead, it was just another confirmation that Ethan had made the right choice. He didn't love Julian anymore. He didn't even resent him. He just felt nothing. A cold, empty nothing that was so much worse than hatred. Hatred would have meant he still cared. This was the silence of a heart that had finally stopped bleeding. Only 7 days left. Ethan began packing his belongings. Everything in the penthouse had been chosen and bought by him. The Italian leather sofa, the custom-built bookshelves, the art on the walls, the Egyptian cotton sheets. He'd made this place a home, and now he was systematically removing all traces of his existence. He packed his clothes, his books, his photographs. He threw away the matching mugs, the matching toothbrushes, the matching pajamas that Julian had never worn. He smashed the frames containing their wedding photos, tore up the cards Julian had given him on their anniversaries, and threw them into the trash. When he was done, nothing remained of the Omega who had loved Julian so desperately. The penthouse was clean, empty, sterile. It looked like a showroom, not a home. It looked like the life he'd never really had. Julian came home unexpectedly and noticed the emptiness. His alpha instincts were momentarily unsettled, but he pushed the feeling away. Did you change everything? It feels different in here. Empty. Ethan nodded. Yes. Julian seemed to think Ethan was throwing a tantrum, some kind of childish protest against the Gala incident. He made a dismissive sound and changed the subject. I didn't leave you behind on purpose during the business trip, you know. It's just that you don't know anything about business, and bringing you along might have exposed our marriage. People would talk. You know how it is. You're better off staying here where it's safe. Ethan said nothing. His words meant nothing to him now. They were just noise, background static in a life he was leaving behind. It's fine, Ethan said quietly. I understand. Julian seemed satisfied. Good. Grandmother's birthday is tomorrow. Make sure you come. She'll be upset if you miss it. His voice softened, and for a moment, he almost looked like the man Ethan had married. I know things have been hard lately, but we're okay, right? We're going to be okay? You're not going to do anything stupid. Ethan nodded. He'd go for Grandmother Hayes' sake. The old woman had always been kind to him, and she deserved to have a peaceful birthday, even if her grandson was a monster. She was the only member of Julian's family who'd ever treated Ethan like a person, and he owed her this much. The next morning, Ethan prepared a beautiful gift for Grandmother Hayes, a custom-tailored silk robe with her initials embroidered in gold thread. He'd commissioned it weeks ago, before everything fell apart, and he was glad he had. The robe was exquisite, made of the finest Chinese silk in her favorite shade of jade green. He wrapped it carefully, placed it in a gift box, and waited for Julian to leave. Instead, an uninvited guest arrived. Liam, wearing a flashy Gucci suit that was entirely inappropriate for a family gathering, walked up to the penthouse door. He was carrying a gift box wrapped in expensive paper, and his expression was smug. He looked like a peacock, all flamboyance and no substance. Good morning, Mr. Hayes, he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. I'm coming along to the birthday party at the Hayes estate, too. I don't know how to drive, so I'll need to ride with Mr. Hayes. Julian was driving a two-seater sports car today. If Liam took the passenger seat, there would be no room for Ethan. Ethan smirked, about to refuse, when Julian walked out of the house. You know how to drive, Ethan? Just take another car from the garage. Ethan hadn't wanted to drive separately simply because he didn't want Grandmother Hayes to see how distant they'd become. Since Julian clearly didn't care, there was no point in insisting. He shrugged. Fine. Liam happily opened the passenger door and climbed in. Rolling down the window, he flashed a triumphant glance at Ethan. Thanks, Mr. Hayes. You're so generous. I really appreciate it. Ethan walked to the garage with a cold face and drove his own car to the Hayes estate. The drive gave him time to think, to steel himself for what was coming. He'd told himself he was fine, that Julian's actions couldn't hurt him anymore. But watching them drive away together, watching Liam take his rightful place in the passenger seat, had stirred something in him. Not jealousy, not longing. Something worse, self-disgust. He'd let himself be replaced so easily, so casually, as if he'd never mattered at all. By the time he arrived, Julian and Liam were already there. The estate's sprawling grounds were filled with expensive cars and well-dressed guests, and the main hall was buzzing with conversation and laughter. The Hayes estate was an old money mansion, all marble and crystal and oil paintings of ancestors no one remembered. It was the kind of place that made you feel small and insignificant, the kind of place that reminded you of your place in the world. All of them knew Julian was married, but none of them had ever seen his husband. The moment they saw Julian arrive with Liam, they crowded around. This must be Mr. Hayes, a society matron gushed, her eyes fixed on Liam. He's so elegant. Mr. Hayes, what a pleasure to finally meet you. We've heard so much about you. You're even more handsome than we imagined. Liam laughed behind his hand, making no effort to clarify. He held Julian's arm possessively, his alpha scent mingling with Julian's in a way that made Ethan's stomach turn. He was playing the part perfectly, the devoted spouse, the beautiful partner. He was everything Ethan had never been allowed to be. Ethan overheard the guests fawning over Liam as he walked into the hall. He was about to find a quiet corner when Grandmother Hayes spotted him and rushed over. "Ethan, my dear boy, you look exhausted. Why didn't you tell me?" She pulled him into a warm embrace, her elderly Omega scent comforting and maternal. "I know everything. I may be old, but I'm not blind. You've suffered enough. I've seen the way he treats you, the way he ignores you. It breaks my heart. You deserve so much better. I'm almost free, grandmother. I just wanted to celebrate your birthday with you. You're the only one who ever made me feel welcome here." Grandmother Hayes accepted Ethan's gift with tears in her eyes. A silk robe. "Ethan, you remembered my favorite color. You always remember everything. You're the only one in this family who pays any attention to me." She hugged him again, then retreated to her room to change, completely ignoring the expensive designer cufflinks Liam had presented on Julian's behalf. Liam couldn't hide his embarrassment. He turned to Julian with a tearful expression, his alpha pride clearly wounded. "Julian, did grandmother hate my gift? I picked it out especially for her, but she didn't even look at it. I spent so much time choosing something perfect. I wanted her to like me." Julian rushed to comfort him. "Of course not. Grandmother just likes her privacy. She's old and set in her ways. She'll love it once she sees it. Don't worry about it." His hand was on Liam's back, rubbing circles that were meant to soothe. It was the same gesture he'd once used with Ethan, back when he still cared. Ethan watched the performance with cold detachment. 25, he'd been a naive fool. 27, he was finally wise. But it had cost him everything. Liam, unable to contain himself, leaned close to Ethan and hissed, "You might win over the old lady, but Julian loves me. He loves me more than he ever loved you. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. I'm going to take everything you have, everything you are, and I'm going to make it mine. You're nothing. You've always been nothing." Ethan didn't react. Liam's childish taunts couldn't touch him anymore. He'd been through too much to be rattled by a jealous rival. He'd weathered worse storms than this and come out the other side. A moment later, Liam splashed a glass of red wine over himself and gasped dramatically. "Ethan, I know I shouldn't have come today, but you didn't have to do that. I was only trying to be friendly. I just wanted everyone to get along." The room went silent. Everyone turned to stare at Ethan, who stood with perfect composure, untouched by the wine, his expression utterly blank. "I didn't do anything," Ethan said flatly. Liam sobbed, his face contorted with false grief. "I know my place. I'll leave right now. I don't want to cause any trouble. I just want everyone to be happy." He turned as if to run out, but Julian grabbed his arm. "Where are you going? You didn't do anything wrong. Don't leave." He turned toward Ethan in a rage, his alpha pheromones flaring with dominance. "If you have a problem with me, take it out on me. I brought him here. He just took the passenger seat. Was it really necessary to throw wine on him in front of everyone? Is this how you were raised? Who does that? What kind of person acts like this?" Liam grabbed Julian's sleeve, sobbing softly. "Don't blame Ethan. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have come today. Please don't yell at him. He's just upset. He's just jealous." Ethan watched the performance calmly, then said dryly, "I didn't throw anything." Liam cried harder. "Why won't you admit it? I know it was you. Why are you lying? What do you have to gain by pretending? Just tell the truth." Seeing Julian's blind fury, Ethan picked up a glass of red wine from the table and threw it directly into Liam's face. Liam shrieked in shock, wine dripping from his hair onto his expensive suit. The liquid ran down his face and neck, staining his collar, ruining his carefully curated image. "Now I did it," Ethan said calmly. "You're welcome. Happy now?" Julian shoved Ethan hard, sending him stumbling backward onto the shattered remains of the wine glass Liam had dropped. Glass fragments cut into Ethan's palm, and blood immediately gushed out. His Omega scent flooded with distress, sweetened sandalwood and cedar, thick and desperate, but Julian didn't seem to notice. He was too focused on Liam. "That's what you get," Julian snarled, wrapping his jacket around Liam's shoulders. "Let's get you out of here. I'll take care of you. I'll make sure you're okay." As Julian walked away with his arm around Liam, Liam flashed Ethan a triumphant, vicious smile. He'd won. He'd always won. And now he was going to take everything. Ethan sat on the floor, bleeding, alone. Grandmother Hayes rushed out, saw the scene, and nearly collapsed. Julian, what have you done? Ethan, child, let me help you up. Oh, my poor boy. Look at your hand. Look at all this blood. It's okay, grandmother. I'll go to the hospital. The hospital? No. I'm calling an ambulance. Right now? I won't have you bleeding out on my floor. I won't let you suffer alone anymore. The emergency room nurse looked at Ethan's bleeding hand. Glass fragments were embedded in his palm, and his suit was stained with wine and blood. Sir, do you need us to call the police? Ethan shook his head. I'm fine. Do you have family? A partner? You shouldn't be alone for this. Ethan shook his head again. His father was dead. His mother had died years ago from complications with her second pregnancy. His pack had scattered after his father's death, leaving him alone. And his husband had done this to him. His husband had pushed him onto broken glass and walked away without looking back. The nurse gently disinfected the wounds, and Ethan gritted his teeth against the pain. It hurt, but he'd been hurting for so long that he'd built up a tolerance. He was a connoisseur of pain, an expert in suffering. He could endure anything. He was walking to the cashier when he ran into Liam, who was strutting through the hospital as if he owned it. Well, Mr. Hayes, what are you doing here all by yourself? He then put on a dramatic expression of realization. Oh, I forgot. Mr. Hayes is staying by my side, so of course he can't be here with you. He's too busy comforting me. He's too busy being my alpha. Liam pulled out a VIP suite room key and waved it in Ethan's face. Julian is so dramatic. I told him I was fine, just a bit shaken up, but he freaked out and insisted I stay in his suite for a few days. He's so overprotective. He always has been. Oh, by the way, how was my acting? Did I look like the helpless victim of your bullying? I've been practicing. I'm getting better. Ethan pulled out his phone, which had been recording their entire conversation. If you don't want Julian hearing this, get out of my sight. Now. Liam froze, his face going pale. What are you going to do with that? You don't need to know. Just get out. Liam's arrogance crumbled. Just you wait. The title of Mr. Hayes will be mine sooner or later. You can't stop me. You're nothing. Ethan laughed, a cold, bitter sound. Take it. I don't want it. You can have the title, the house, the company. I want nothing. I want none of it. It was never mine to begin with. Grandmother Hayes was furious when she learned what happened. She couldn't reach Julian. He'd been in the hospital with Liam the entire time. So she came straight to Ethan's apartment. Ethan, my dear boy, why didn't you tell me? I would have put a stop to this. I would have done something. I could have helped. She held his bandaged hand, her eyes filled with sorrow. I know he's my grandson, but I can't defend what he's done. The way he's treated you, it's disgraceful. He's a disgrace to this family. To himself. It's okay, grandmother. Julian and I have already signed the divorce papers. In a few days, it'll be final. I'm almost free. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. The old Omega sat down heavily. I'll have my attorneys draft an inventory. Everything Julian owes you, every single penny, will be returned. I won't let him get away with this. I've let him get away with too much already. Ethan shook his head. I don't want his money. I just want to be free. That's all I've ever wanted. That's all I've ever needed. Ethan, your father's pen, his heirlooms, your reputation, your dignity. He should pay for what he's done. He should suffer the consequences. He should learn. Ethan finally nodded. On one condition. You don't confront him. Let me handle it. Please. I need to do this myself. I need to be the one to walk away. But Julian came home anyway, furious. What did you say to grandmother? She called me screaming. Is this your revenge, Ethan? You knew Liam wasn't feeling well, and you had grandmother force me back here. He'd clearly come straight from the hospital, his suit rumpled, his alpha pheromones flaring with irritation. Ethan didn't respond. Julian looked down and finally noticed Ethan's bandaged hand. He faltered, reaching into his pocket. Look, Ethan, I've been under a lot of pressure. I lost my temper at the party. I didn't mean to push you that hard. You just made me so angry. I didn't know what I was doing. He pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal an expensive Cartier watch. I bought you a gift. Stop making a scene. Take it. I'm trying to make things right. Back when they were still pretending to be in love, Julian would buy Ethan extravagant gifts after every argument, and Ethan would accept them. But that wasn't love. That was just the polite way of ending a fight without having to admit fault. It was the way rich people apologized, with money instead of words. Ethan laughed, a humorless sound. Keep it. I don't want anything from you. I don't want your gifts, your apologies, or your presents. We're done. Signed and sealed. There's nothing left to save. There's nothing left to fix. Julian's expression darkened. You've become so difficult. What's gotten into you? Liam's just a fling. He's just a distraction. You're my real husband. You're the only one worthy of the Hayes name. Just give me a few more years. Once I've had my fun, I'll come back to you. I always come back. I always will. Ethan stood up. I'm going to bed. See? Julian called after him. That's better. You're always so reasonable. You always know what's best. 2 days later, Ethan went shopping for a celebration outfit. He wanted to look spectacular on the day his divorce was finalized. He deserved to feel beautiful for himself, after all. He'd spent so long trying to be invisible that he'd forgotten how to shine. He'd spent so long being someone else's shadow that he'd forgotten how to be his own man. He spotted a gorgeous suit in a store window, custom-tailored in the most stunning shade of sapphire blue, with a cut that would emphasize his lean figure perfectly. It was the kind of suit that demanded attention, and Ethan wanted to be seen for once. He walked inside and asked the sales associate to pull it down for him. Of course, Mr. Hayes. I'll get it for you right away. It's one of our finest pieces. The fabric is imported from Italy. It's a one-of-a-kind piece. But before the associate could reach it, Liam's voice cut through the air. That's perfect. I'll take it. Wrap it up. The sales associate looked torn. Mr. Hayes saw it first, sir. Perhaps I could show you something else. Liam sneered. I spend tens of thousands here every month. Are you saying I can't even try on a suit? Besides, he doesn't need it. He'll never look good in something like that. He doesn't have the body for it. He's too skinny. Too weak. Ethan's hand closed over the other end of the garment bag. I saw this first, Liam. I'd suggest you learn some manners. First come, first served. It's a basic rule of civilization. First come, first served depends on who wants it more. Liam yanked on the suit, and Ethan held fast. I love it the most, so it belongs to me. And then Liam threw himself backward onto the floor, screaming. He pushed me. Julian, he pushed me. Julian appeared out of nowhere, rushing to Liam's side. His alpha pheromones flared with possessive anger. Ethan, are you insane? Liam just got out of the hospital. He's still weak. How could you push him? What is wrong with you? He's faking. Julian shoved Ethan backward onto the marble floor. The back of Ethan's head slammed against a display case. Pain exploded through his skull, and his vision went white. He slumped against the counter, blood trickling from his scalp. His Omega instincts were screaming, but he couldn't even cry out. Julian ignored him completely, helping Liam up. Are you hurt? Did he hit you? Let's get out of here. I'll take you somewhere safe. I'll make sure he can't hurt you again. As Julian walked away with his arm around Liam, Liam flashed Ethan a triumphant grin. Ethan lay on the cold marble, wondering how he'd been so foolish. He'd thought if he ignored Liam, the man wouldn't dare escalate. But Liam was desperate to push him out, and Julian was too blind to see it. Eventually, Ethan pushed himself up. His head was pounding, and his vision swam, but the pain was nothing compared to what he'd already endured. He grabbed the sapphire suit and tossed it at Liam's feet. Since you want it so badly, take it. Take everything. I don't care. I have no use for any of it. Liam caught the subtext. His smile widened. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. You're so generous. Julian, oblivious, thought Ethan was being generous. Finally, you're being reasonable. See, that wasn't so hard. I knew you'd come around. Ethan walked out of the boutique without looking back. His phone buzzed with a text from Connor. Connor, where are you? I've been trying to reach you. Ethan typed back with trembling fingers. Ethan, shopping. Something for the divorce. Can you pick me up? Connor, already on my way. Wait for me. Outside the shopping mall, Ethan's vision blurred, and he collapsed near the entrance. Good Samaritans called an ambulance. Connor, who'd been minutes away, rushed to the hospital in a panic. When Ethan woke up, Connor was sitting by his bed, dark stubble shadowing his jaw, his brown eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. His scent was tinged with anxiety, and his hands were shaking. "You're awake." Connor's voice cracked. "You scared the hell out of me. How could you not tell me something this big happened? I got a call from the hospital, and I didn't know what to think. I drove here like a maniac, and you were unconscious, and the nurses wouldn't tell me anything." "It's okay," Ethan said weakly. "I can handle it. I've been handling it for years. I know you can. But I want you to rely on me." Connor took his hand, his grip warm and steady. "You chose me, Ethan. Why won't you let me help you? Why do you always have to do everything alone? It's just a simple divorce. I didn't want to involve you in Julian's mess. You don't deserve to be dragged into that." Connor laughed, a soft, incredulous sound. "You think I care about Julian? I care about you. Everything else is just noise. I've been in love with you since we were teenagers. I'm not going to let you push me away now. Not ever." Ethan squeezed his hand. "I'm okay. 2 days left, and I'm free. But after I move out, I won't have anywhere to stay. Young Master Vance better take me in." Connor's smile was blinding. "I've been wanting you to move in with me for years." "Done. If I remember correctly, there are only 2 days left until your marriage is officially over. I'll pick you up when it's done. I'll be there every step of the way." Ethan nodded, a warm sweetness blooming in his chest. This was what it felt like to be cherished. It was a feeling Julian had never given him, and it made him realize how foolish he'd been to wait around in a loveless void for so long. He'd been so desperate for Julian's love that he'd forgotten he deserved love at all. His phone rang, and he answered without thinking. "Ethan," Julian's voice came through. "Liam really likes that fountain pen on your nightstand. The one from your father. Give it to him. He wants it as a keepsake. It's important to him." Ethan sat straight up in the hospital bed, rage flooding through him. "Julian, what did you just say? You know what that pen means to me. You know it was my father's. You know he gave it to me on his deathbed. What's the big deal? It's just a pen, Ethan. I'll buy you a better one. I'll buy you 100 pens. Why do you always have to make everything so difficult? That's not the point. Enough. It's just a pen. I'm informing you, not asking. By the way, bring home some chocolate cake. Liam wants some. He's been craving it all day. He's been so stressed." The line went dead. Ethan's hands shook. Connor had heard everything. "Ethan, what's wrong?" "He wants my father's pen. He knows how much it means to me. And he wants me to bring cake for his mistress. He wants me to serve them. He wants me to be their servant." Connor's expression darkened. "What do you want me to do?" "I'll do anything. Just say the word." "Nothing. I'll handle this. But I need you to do me one favor." At the Hayes residence, Liam was gloating as he held Ethan's fountain pen. He'd taken it from the nightstand without permission, handling it with malicious carelessness. The pen was engraved with Ethan's father's name, a memorial to a man who'd been a legend in the publishing world. Liam didn't care. He just wanted to make Ethan's life miserable. "Look at this," Liam said to Julian, waving the pen around. "It's so old-fashioned. What's the point of writing with something like this when we have computers? It's just a sentimental toy, and his father's name is on it. How pathetic." Julian shrugged. He really loved it. It was his father's. He always talks about it. He's very attached to it. His father's? How sweet. And now it's mine. When Ethan walked into the penthouse, he found Liam lying in his bed, wearing his clothes. The fountain pen lay on the table, disassembled, its parts scattered like broken bones. The clothes Liam was wearing were his, a cashmere sweater he'd bought for himself on his last birthday, a pair of tailored slacks he'd had made in London. "Get out of my bed. Now." Liam looked up, feigning innocence. "Oh, Ethan. You're back. I was just borrowing some clothes. Julian's closet is so boring. He has no taste at all. He doesn't know how to dress himself." Julian walked into the room. "Ethan, you need to calm down. Liam was just looking for something to wear. There's no need to overreact. He didn't mean any harm. He was just trying to be comfortable." Ethan walked over to the table, and reassembled the pen with practiced hands. His father had taught him how to take it apart and put it back together, and he'd done it hundreds of times. It wasn't broken. He'd been so afraid that Liam had damaged it, but it was whole. If you ever touch this again, Julian, I won't be responsible for what happens. I'm warning you now. This is the last time. Julian shrank back. It's just a pen, Ethan. Why do you always have to make such a big deal out of everything? Ethan ignored him. He turned to Liam, his eyes blazing. And you know exactly what you're doing. You think you can push me out and take everything I've built. But you're wrong. I'm leaving on my own terms. You're just the symptom, not the problem. You're nothing. He walked out of the penthouse for the last time. 2 more days. Just 2 more days. 2 days later, Ethan arrived at the penthouse carrying a thick stack of legal documents. Julian was just waking up, emerging from his bedroom in nothing but sweatpants, his alpha build on display. He yawned and stretched, and for a moment, Ethan almost felt sorry for him. He was so confident, so sure of himself, so utterly blind to what was about to happen. These are the asset division documents, Ethan said calmly. Take a look. The divorce is officially final today. Congratulations, Julian. You can live happily ever after with your mistress. And congratulate me, I'm finally free. I'm done. He placed his copy of the divorce agreement on the coffee table and watched as Julian's face went white. Wait, you're really doing this? You're leaving me? After everything I've given you? After everything I've done for you? You've given me nothing but pain, Julian. I'm done. I've been done for a long time. I just didn't know it until tonight. Ethan walked out the door without looking back. He left the penthouse, the marriage, the years of suffering, and walked into the crisp morning air. It tasted like freedom. It smelled like possibility. It felt like the first day of the rest of his life. Across the street, Connor was leaning against his car, scrolling through his phone. When he saw Ethan approaching, he smiled, opened the door, and pulled out an enormous bouquet of red roses. He walked toward Ethan, handed him the flowers, and looked at him with such pure tenderness that Ethan felt his eyes sting. Congratulations on your freedom. Ethan took the flowers, buried his face in them, and breathed deep. They're beautiful. They're perfect. Thank you. Connor took the documents from him, leaned down, and kissed his cheek. You're beautiful. You look like you just shed 10 years of weight. You look free. You look like yourself again. Ethan laughed, pushing him gently. Stop it. Connor's smile was warm. He glanced over Ethan's shoulder and spotted Julian frantically rushing out of the penthouse. A cool challenge flashed in his eyes. He wrapped his arm around Ethan's waist and guided him toward the car. It's chilly out here. Let's go home. I'll make you breakfast. I'll make you whatever you want. Okay. Ethan settled into the passenger seat, and Connor drove off. The penthouse grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror, until it was just another building in the skyline. Connor's scent filled the car, steady and warm and protective, and Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years, safety. He felt like he could finally breathe. He felt like he could finally live. Weeks later, Ethan was helping Connor in the kitchen of his penthouse. They were living together now, sharing a life that felt more real than anything he'd ever had with Julian. Connor's apartment was warm and inviting, filled with books and photographs and the scent of pine and cedar. It smelled like home. Connor was making chicken soup from scratch, a recipe his grandmother had taught him. The kitchen smelled amazing, and Ethan's omega instincts were purring with contentment. Is it supposed to look like that? Ethan asked, peering into the pot. It looks kind of gray. It looks like mud. Connor laughed. My grandmother said the same thing. It's a secret family recipe. You have to marry me before I tell you. That's the rule. My grandmother's rule. You can't break it. I already said yes to your proposal. What's it worth to you? Connor pulled him close, kissing the corner of his mouth. Everything. You're worth everything. You're the only thing that matters. The doorbell rang, and Ethan went to answer it. He pulled the door open and found Julian standing in the hallway, looking haggard and desperate. His suit was rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed, and his scent was a mess of panic and regret. Ethan, please, let me talk to you. I need to explain. I need to make things right. What are you doing here? How did you find me? I need you. I need to fix this. Please. Connor appeared behind Ethan, his arm wrapping protectively around his waist. What do you want, Julian? You have no right to be here. Julian's eyes darted to Connor, and he sneered. So you got what you wanted, didn't you? You waited until I was weak, and then you swooped in and stole him. This was your plan all along. You wanted him from the beginning. Connor's expression went cold. I didn't steal anyone. You gave him up the moment you kissed your secretary at the gala. I just gave him somewhere to land. You pushed him away. I caught him. I'll never let him go. You're a bastard. I'm not the one who cheated on his husband for a year. I'm not the one who let his secretary take everything and then blame the victim. Look in a mirror, Julian. You did this to yourself. You destroyed your own marriage. You destroyed your own life. Julian's face contorted with fury. He swung a fist at Connor, but Connor sidestepped easily, letting Julian stumble into the wall. Is this how you solve all your problems? Connor asked. By hitting people? By pushing them onto glass? By abandoning them in hospitals? You're pathetic. Julian scrambled up, his eyes wild. I'm sorry, Ethan. Please. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. Just give me another chance. I'll change. I'll do anything. I'll give you anything. Ethan shook his head. There's nothing left to fix. We're over, Julian. We've been over for months. You just didn't notice. You never notice anything. I'll give you anything. I don't want anything from you. I'm happy with Connor. Happier than I ever was with you. He makes me feel like a person. He makes me feel seen. Julian's face crumbled. Why? What does he have that I don't? Ethan's expression softened. Because he sees me. He always has. He saw me when I was invisible. He loved me when I was unlovable. Connor stepped forward, his voice cold. Get out of here. If I see you near Ethan again, I'll have you arrested. I'll have you deported. I'll do whatever it takes. He called building security, who escorted Julian out of the building. Inside, Ethan and Connor stood in the hallway, their hands intertwined. I'm sorry you had to see that, Connor said. He should have left you alone. He's never going to leave you alone. Ethan shook his head. It's fine. I'm done with him. Really. I've been done with him for a long time. Connor kissed his forehead. I'm not done with you. We're just getting started. That spring, Ethan and Connor traveled to Lake Tahoe for a vacation. It had been months since the divorce, and Ethan felt lighter and freer than he'd felt in years. Connor's sister, Lauren, owned a resort in Tahoe, and the Zachary family had an estate nearby. Connor wanted to introduce Ethan to his extended family. I'm nervous, Ethan admitted as they drove up the winding road to the Zachary estate. What if they don't like me? What if I'm not good enough for them? Connor laughed. Ethan, my family has been trying to set me up with Omegas for years. They'll love you. You're the first person I've ever brought home. You're the only person I've ever loved. Seriously? I was waiting for you. I didn't want to settle. I wanted you. Ethan's heart swelled. You're too good to me. Impossible. The Zachary estate was beautiful, sprawling across a hillside with views of the lake and the mountains. Connor's family welcomed Ethan with open arms, pulling him into warm embraces and fussing over him like he was one of their own. So you're the one, Lauren said, smiling at Ethan. Connor has been pining over you for years. I'm so glad he finally made a move. He's been impossible to live with. Every time we saw each other, he'd talk about you. Ethan this, Ethan that. Do you think Ethan is happy? Do you think Ethan is okay? Ethan blushed. I'm the lucky one, really. He's been amazing. The gala was that evening. Ethan was nervous, but Connor kept his hand on his waist the whole time, a steady, grounding presence. They were standing near the buffet table when Julian walked in. Julian's alpha pheromones were muted, his frame thin and drawn. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the months since their divorce. Liam was on his arm, his face pale, his alpha scent tinged with anxiety. Connor leaned close to Ethan. Do you want to leave? We can go anywhere. Ethan shook his head. No. He doesn't get to chase me away. Julian spotted them and made his way over, a desperate look on his face. Ethan, I didn't expect to see you here. We're visiting family, Connor said coolly. What are you doing here? Business. Julian's eyes lingered on Ethan. You look happy. You look good. I am, Ethan said. Very happy. Happier than I've ever been. Julian nodded slowly. I'm glad. I really am. He glanced at Connor. You won. You know that. I'm not trying to win anything. I just want Ethan to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted. Julian's jaw tightened. Fine. Congratulations. You got what you always wanted. Connor shrugged. And you got what you deserved. Nothing. Liam's alpha instincts flared. How dare you? Connor's pheromones flooded the space. How dare I what? Accuse your husband of being a cheater? He cheated on his actual husband with you, Liam. You were the other man. You don't get to be offended by the truth. You're a homewrecker. You knew he was married. Liam's face went white. Julian, do something. Julian hung his head. Just go, Liam. I need to talk to him alone. Julian. Go. Now. Liam stormed off, and Julian looked at Ethan with pleading eyes. Ethan, I know I messed up. I know I was a horrible husband. But I'm begging you. Just talk to me. Ethan shook his head. There's nothing to talk about. We're done. I've changed. I know I have. Just give me another chance. Another chance? Julian, you had 2 years. 2 years of my love, my loyalty, my devotion. I gave you everything I had, and you threw it away for a moment of fun. I'm not the same person I was. I've moved on. You need to move on too. Please. Julian, look at me. Ethan's voice was firm. I loved you. I really, truly loved you. And you destroyed that love. There's no coming back from what you did. I don't hate you. I just don't care anymore. That's the worst part, isn't it? I feel nothing. You're nothing to me. Julian's face crumbled. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. 6 months later, Ethan and Connor were married in a beautiful ceremony at the Vance estate. The day was perfect, sunny and warm, with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves of the ancient oaks lining the property. Ethan wore a bespoke white suit that made him look striking, and Connor wore a matching one in charcoal gray. Their hands trembled as they exchanged vows, and neither of them could stop smiling. I've loved you my whole life, Connor said, his voice thick with emotion. I waited for you when I was too young to know what love was. I waited for you when you married someone else. I waited for you when you were unhappy, and I prayed every night that someday you'd see me the way I saw you. And now you're here. You chose me. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. Ethan's eyes were wet. Connor, you were always there for me. Even when I was too blind to see. You held me up when I was falling apart. You made me feel worthy of love. I'm never going to let you go. They kissed, and the audience erupted in cheers. Connor's family surrounded them, pulling them into group embraces. Ethan's few remaining relatives were there, too, and even Grandmother Hayes had made the trip, her eyes shining with happy tears. Your family, Grandmother Hayes said, embracing Ethan tightly. No matter what happens, you'll always be family. A month after the wedding, Ethan was in the bathroom, staring at a positive pregnancy test. 2 lines. He was going to be a father. He walked out and handed the test to Connor, who was still in bed. Connor looked at it, and his eyes went wide. Ethan, is this? Yes. We're having a baby. Connor leaped up, pulling him into a fierce embrace. We're going to have a baby. Ethan, we're having a baby. I can't believe this. I'm going to be a father. Ethan laughed, tears streaming down his face. I know. We're going to be parents. You're going to be an amazing father. I know you will. The pregnancy was difficult, but Ethan was strong, and Connor was by his side every step of the way. 10 months later, Ethan gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Carter Vance Jr., a perfect blend of his parents' features. Connor held him for the first time and wept. He looks just like you, Ethan. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Ethan's heart swelled. He has your nose. And your chin. And your stubbornness. Connor laughed. No one wants my nose. I do. I want every part of you. Every part of him. On the day of Carter Jr.'s christening, Ethan saw Julian outside the church. Julian was holding a baby girl in his arms, her dark hair and serious expression a stark contrast to her surroundings. She was dressed in a simple white dress, and Julian was holding her with the careful, tentative grip of a new father. "Julian," Ethan said softly. Julian looked up. His eyes were tired, his face lined with grief. "Ethan, you look happy." "I am," Ethan said. "Very happy." Julian nodded, looking down at the baby in his arms. "This is Joy. She's mine. My daughter." "What happened to Liam?" "He left. He left her with me, and took the money grandmother gave him. I haven't heard from him since. He didn't even say goodbye. He just disappeared." Ethan sighed. "I'm sorry, Julian. I really am. No one deserves that." Julian's eyes were wet. "I know I ruined everything. I know I can't make up for what I did. But I'm trying to be a good father. It's the only thing I have left. It's the only thing I'm good for now." Ethan felt a pang of pity. "You can be a good father, Julian. You can be a good person. Just let the past go. For her sake. For your sake." "Ethan," Connor called from the church doors. "It's time." Ethan walked over to his husband, who was holding their son. He kissed Connor's cheek and turned back to Julian one last time. "I hope you're happy, Julian. I really do." Julian nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Take care of yourself, Ethan, and take care of him." "I will." Ethan and Connor walked back into the church, surrounded by their family and friends. The christening was beautiful, and Ethan stood beside his husband, holding their son, and felt nothing but joy. Julian watched from outside the doors, and for the first time, he understood what he'd lost. But he also understood that he had to move on. For Joy. For himself. He turned and walked away, the baby girl in his arms. Ethan glanced out the church window and saw him go. His heart ached for a moment, not for what they'd had, but for what they never could have had. And then he let it go. He was home,